Hey everybody, thanks for joining me here for this video. In this video, we're going to be walking through chapter 6 of our organizational behavior textbook and talking about perception and individual decision making. Perception is the process by which individuals organize and interpret their sensory impressions to give meaning to their environment. And perception is critical to organizational behavior. What I've got up here, this picture of Homer Simpson that you're looking at the bottom of the screen, this is a picture from a scene in The Simpsons where there is a fire in the nuclear power plant, but all Homer can see is clowns. His perception of everything going on is clowns performing. So he doesn't respond to the fire at all because even though it's a major problem in the power plant and he's a safety inspector, his perception is just clowns. Okay? And that's the problem with perceptions, or what we need to understand about perceptions in organizational behavior, is that people respond to perceptions. They don't respond to reality. Now, if we think about this in a more realistic context and we walk away from the Simpsons and clowns, what does this mean for us in our organizations? Well, as a manager, you're not necessarily responding to the behavior of your subordinates. You're responding to your perception of their behavior. Just like your subordinates are not responding to how you're actually treating them, they're responding to their perception of how you're treating them. So, managing perceptions is a very important part of what we do in organizations. Now, as we move through this lesson, we're going to talk a lot about things that influence our perceptions. So, what I'd like you to do here for just a moment is take a look at the image on your screen. And I want you to think about, aside from color, are all of the designs below the same? Are there any designs that are different from the rest of the images on the screen? Okay, so you can pause the video and take as much time as you need to do that. Now, as we zoom in on one part of the video here and we isolate some of these targets, what we see over here is that there is one target that did not have a leg. Okay, so all of the rest of the images here had a back leg, like you see over here on the left, but there was one and only one that was missing a leg. Now let's do that same exercise again, but this time we're going to do it with fewer images on the screen. Okay, so once again, you can go ahead and pause the video if you need to take a minute to look at the picture. Now, if we isolate a couple targets again here, what you will see is that over here on the left, we had one target again that was missing a leg. Okay. Now, you'll also notice that this target here happened to be the only one that was yellow in the line. So next, I want you to take a look at the image here and think about how attractive does the individual in the black shirt in this picture look? And it doesn't necessarily mean how attracted to them are you, but just how attractive do they look in general? And just think of a number between 1 and 10 and either write it down or just remember it in your head, and we'll come back to it shortly. Okay. Once again, you can pause the video if you need to. Now, here's a different image with the same individual, same pose, same shirt. Okay, but we have a completely different background. I want you to think about how attractive does the individual in the black shirt look in this picture? Okay. Once you've applied a number to that, I want you to think about how does that number compare to the previous image that you looked at? Is it higher? Is it lower? Is it the same? Now, the points of these exercises are to illustrate that to you that we do not evaluate our targets in isolation. Okay, so if we were to look at the Brad Pitt exercise there, okay, sometimes students rate Brad Pitt in front of Rodeo Drive, the shopping plaza, as more attractive than Brad Pitt in front of the dump. And the rationale behind that is that with that nice, beautiful background, his attractiveness really stands out. All right. Sometimes students rate Brad Pitt in front of the dump as being more attractive than Brad Pitt in front of Rodeo Drive. And the rationale behind that is they say that his attractiveness really stands out when he's in front of that terrible background. Okay. What rarely happens in my classes, though, when I do this exercise, is I rarely have students rate his attractiveness to be exactly the same in both pictures, because depending on which background he's in front of, they think that his attractiveness level changes. All right. Now, if we go back to the find the one that's different exercise, in the first slide that I showed you, there were there were probably about 100 different little images in that slide. And when I do that in class, usually about half of my class will get that wrong. Okay? Usually about half of the class will say that everything looked the same. All right? But then when we go to the next slide and there's only 10 images, usually my entire class will get that correct. Now there's a variety of different things that we're looking at there. One, in the first image, there's more distractions than there are in the second image. Okay, two, in the first image, I used a variety of different colors. So there are more things drawing your attention. There are more differences that are not relevant to the question. Okay. In the second image, everything that's the same is one color. The one that's different is also a different color. All right. The other thing is when you get to the second image, you know what you're looking for. All right. You know what's going to be different. So, these are all contextual factors that help to influence our perception of is anything different in these images. So, what we've been talking about so far are factors that influence our perception. Okay. And really, the factors that we've been looking at kind of straddle the areas of factors in the situation and factors in the target. Okay. Because background is something that we've been talking about. All right. These could maybe be considered factors in the target, but they also could be factors in the situation, depending on what your perspective is here. All right. Factors in the situation often deal with time, the work setting, and the social setting, so different areas that we look at within the context. All right. Factors within the target tend to deal with the novelty of the target. All right. And then a variety of other factors around the target. So by novelty, what we're referring to is essentially, is the target different? Is the target unique? So if we were looking at, say, the image earlier where there were 10 stick figures and you were asked to find the one that's different, the one that was different not only had a different structure, but it was colored yellow while the others were colored purple, so it stood out in that sense as well. It was very novel. All right. We also consider factors in the perceiver, so each of us perceive situations differently. All right. Now, when we consider how we observe people's behavior, we often think about, was this action caused internally or was it caused externally? Was it caused by the person or was it caused by something other than the person? And one theory that helps to explain how we make these determinations is attribution theory. I actually use attribution theory quite a bit in my research. It's a really, really interesting theory about all the factors that influence how we allocate blame or how we give credit. And there are three different factors that we consider within attribution theory. And the first one is distinctiveness. Okay. And as we think about distinctiveness, do you behave similarly in other situations? All right. So we're not talking about the same situation here, but we're talking about different situations. So let's say we have an employee and that employee is late to work today. Now, if that employee is typically somebody who does good work, who's respectful at work, who maybe is very productive, who is well liked, then we would say that being late is distinct because it's not consistent with all the other behaviors that we talked about. Okay. Then we have consensus. Do other people behave similarly in this situation? So if that employee was late to work today, but everyone was late to work today, then we would have high consensus. Okay. Because other people are behaving the same way. Everybody was late. All right. If the employee was late to work today and nobody else was late, we would have low consensus. And then we have consistency. All right, so do you usually behave similarly in this situation? So here, when we're talking about consistency, we're just worried about one behavior or one context. So the employee was late to work today. Are they usually late? Were they late yesterday? Were they late the day before? Okay, that's where we're looking at consistency. Now, people often get distinctiveness and consistency mixed up. So I'm going to try to clarify them for you here. All right, when we talk about consistency, we're just looking at one situation or one type of behavior. So if we're trying to attribute behavior for lateness, we're only looking at things that have to do with being late. When we're looking at distinctiveness, however, we're looking at other situations. So if we're trying to attribute behavior for lateness, we're also looking at your performance, we're looking at your interactions with others, we're looking at a variety of other factors. So distinctiveness is how do you behave in other situations, and consistency is how do you behave in this situation. Now, when we talk about internally and externally caused behaviors, what exactly do we mean? When we talk about internally caused, we mean things that we think that the individual caused. So, an example would be Joe hit sales plan because of his hard work and dedication. When we talk about externally caused, we're talking about things that we think resulted from outside causes. So, for example, Joe hit sales plan because of the great economy. So now we're going to combine this idea of internally and externally caused behavior with the three different aspects of attribution theory that we talked about to see how it all works out. So when an individual has behavior that is high on distinctiveness, this is something that we kind of would say is out of character. Okay? And because it's out of character, we tend to attribute that behavior to external causes. All right? If they have behavior that is low on distinctiveness, okay, then that means it's kind of normal behavior for them. And in that case, we would tend to think that it's internal causes. All right. If they have behavior that is high on consensus, then that means that everybody is doing something. So it's likely not the cause of that one individual. But if it's low on consensus, then that person really stands out. Remember, we evaluate our targets within context. If it's low on consensus, the person really stands out. We tend to think that's probably more internal. All right. Now, if a behavior is high on consistency, then we look at the person typically acts this way. It's probably internally caused. If it's low on consistency, then we look at the person doesn't act this way that often. It's probably externally caused. All right. Now, the other important thing to remember, we talked about how people get distinctiveness and consistency mixed up. The other thing to remember is the way these terms are structured, they're kind of inverse, right? So if something is high on consistency, then it always happens or frequently happens, and we attribute it to internal behavior. But if something is high on distinctiveness, then it's something that is really unique at that point in time and out of character, and we tend to attribute the cause to something external. So remember, in addition to there being differences in the definitions of distinctiveness and consistency, the terms are also worded in such a way that they're somewhat inverses. Then we have something known as the fundamental attribution error. And the fundamental attribution error just basically means that we tend to underestimate the influence of external factors and overestimate the influence of personal factors. So we tend to give people more blame for failure and more credit for success than what is probably due. All right. And an example of that might be if you were to look at somebody who is playing a basketball game, and let's say they score 30 points, and that's a lot of points, we'll give them a lot of credit for the points that they scored. But we don't often slow down and say, oh, well, they played against a bad team, or we don't, or they played against a bad team, or, maybe one of the other really good scorers on the team was out, so they had to shoot more. We don't often do things like that. And the same thing happens in our organizations. If a company is highly successful, we tend to give the CEO credit. If the company is failing, we tend to blame the CEO. And we often don't think about all the other external things in the market as we're making these attributions. Along the lines of the fundamental attribution error, we also have something called a self-serving bias. And this is where we tend to attribute our own successes to internal factors and our failures to external factors. So if you do really well on a test, you recognize yourself as smart, you recognize yourself as having studied hard, you recognize all the great things you did that led to your good test grade. But if you have a poor test, you tend to look and say, "Oh, the instructor didn't explain this well, or the book is really bad, or this test is way too hard." Okay. So we tend to look at our outcomes and attribute them internally if our outcomes are successful, and attribute causes externally if our outcomes are failures. Now, as we continue to move forward here, I want to circle back to this idea of recognizing what we perceive and why we perceive it. All right. And the pictures that you're looking at here from a psychology experiment known as Gorillas in Our Midst. And what they did in this experiment is they asked people to count all the passes that students in the white shirt made with the basketball. So you can see this person here is passing the basketball. Now they're passing the basketball over here. All right, and they asked people to focus on the basketball passes, but just for the team in the white colored shirts. So try to ignore the team in the black colored shirts. Well, what happened is the basketball was passed 15 times, and if you notice that, you got the correct answer. But in the middle of this experiment, a person wearing a gorilla costume walked into the middle of all the basketball players and then started beating on their chest and then ended up walking out. All right. And at the end of the experiment, one of the things that they try to figure out is, did people see the gorilla? And quite a large percentage of people in the experiment didn't see the gorilla. I do this in class often, and I often have a lot of students who don't see the gorilla. Never know a true number because obviously not everybody admits to not seeing the gorilla, but there's always some that acknowledge that they didn't see the gorilla. And the point of this experiment was to show us that when we dial in our focus on something that we're specifically directed to focus on, there can be another stimuli right in front of us that we don't even notice. Okay, so essentially, that things that we're unaware of aren't just because the information wasn't available to us, but it could be because our focus was preventing us from recognizing the information. Now, what the gorillas in the midst relates to that we're going to talk about here is this idea of selective perception. Okay, and selective perception is something that we engage in. It's a shortcut, and it's basically because there's so much information around us that we can't perceive everything. And characteristics that make a person or an object or an event stand out kind of increase the probability that that they'll be perceived. So, in the gorillas in the midst example, what made the basketball stand out is that people were asked to watch the basketball. Okay, so their focus was there, and that's why they missed some of the other things going on around them. All right, in the workplace, sometimes how loud a person is might influence whether or not you notice them. Sometimes somebody's performance might influence whether or not you notice them. All right, I had a coworker who used to sing happy birthday on the PA system and was always telling jokes all day long. So everything that he did was visible to all management. And there were certain executives in the company who actually really, had a negative perception of this employee because not only did they see the positive things he did, but they also saw the negative things that he did because he was constantly drawing attention to himself. Other people in the office did similar negative things to this employee, but they weren't drawing the same level of attention to themselves, so they didn't end up facilitating the creation of a negative perception in the same way that this person did. Another factor for us to consider is something called the halo effect. All right, and the halo effect occurs when we basically draw an impression on someone based upon other characteristics that they have. So let's say we have an employee who's a really good salesperson. We might draw positive positive impression of a variety of other traits for them. We might perceive them as intelligent, we might perceive them as sociable, we might perceive them as knowledgeable, a whole lot of positive impressions that may not all be justified because they're being based on this one thing that we're drawing our impressions on. Similarly, there's something called a Horns effect, and the Horns effect basically states the exact opposite. That if somebody has a really noticeable negative characteristic, we tend to judge all their other characteristics within that light. The idea of contrast effects says that we don't evaluate people in isolation, but we consider them in terms of others that we've encountered. All right. So for those of us who don't alligator wrestle, we would look at Paul Bedard here from Gator Boys, and we would say, "Oh my gosh, either he's lost his mind, or he's incredibly brave, or something." But we would think a very extreme thought about what he does in terms of the gator wrestling that he engages in. Right. For people who are in the gator wrestling community, they don't necessarily look at Paul and see anything that's all that out of the ordinary because they are constantly influenced by people who are doing very similar things to Paul. Whereas to most of us, Paul's behavior here is pretty novel. So how this applies to us in business or in management is that if an employee does something that's really great, but other employees are also doing similar things that are really great, we might not recognize that the way we should. So let's say somebody lands a $2 million account, and that's kind of a big deal. If landing a $2 million account is a big deal in that it helps your business, but it's not uncommon, we might not recognize the employee who lands that account the same way that we would if landing such an account was an uncommon thing in our organization. Another important component to attribution theory is stereotyping. And this is when we judge someone based upon the perceptions associated with a group that they belong to. Okay. And there's a lot of research out there that shows that when leaders in different positions perform well or don't perform well, that they're judged differently in ways that we can only attribute to factors such as race and gender. All right. And this is part of stereotyping. We have to be careful that we monitor ourselves to make sure that we're not unfairly applying stereotypes to people in evaluations and decisions. Now, where our perceptions start to come into play is as we start to make decisions, okay? And we make decisions choosing from two or more alternatives, often in reaction to a problem. All right. So a lot of times we have a goal or a desired course that we're hoping to meet, and we're not on track to get there. And we have to choose which direction we're going to go in. So for example, one of the first management positions I had, I took over a unit that was losing six figures a year. They had their revenues were down over $1 million. But essentially, what happened was the upper leadership had to make a decision about how they were gonna resolve this problem. And the decision that they made, they had some options. They could have stayed the course with the manager they had and hoped that they could figure it out. They could have stayed the course with that manager and tried to make some other structural changes, or they could have changed management. And in that case, their response to the problem was to change management. As we think about how to make decisions, one way that we can make decisions is through something called the rational decision making model. And in this model, we first start by defining our problem. Then we identify what our criteria are for making a decision. We allocate weights to the criteria. So we decide what criteria are most important, what criteria are the least important, and what criteria fall somewhere in the middle. All right, then we start to develop alternatives. We start to evaluate these alternative courses of action, and we select the best alternative from our list. There are some assumptions, though, with the rational model that are a little bit problematic. The first assumption is that the decision maker has complete information. Okay, it's very rare that we know everything about a situation. There's often gaps that we're filling in where we don't have complete information. So, this is a really tough assumption. The second assumption is that the decision maker is able to identify all the relevant options in an unbiased manner. Okay, and sometimes decision makers just aren't able to see all the options around them. All right. So this is another problematic assumption. And the third assumption is that the decision maker is going to choose the option with the highest utility. Now, this can be a little bit problematic because we would expect them to choose the option with the highest utility. But if there's any problems in the evaluative process, they might not choose the option with the highest utility. Okay. And for these reasons, most decisions in the real world don't actually follow the rational model. To illustrate some of the challenges with the rational model, I want you to consider a case. Imagine that it's Monday morning and your sales team is understaffed and you need to bring in candidates for open sales positions to interview next week. All right, you have to invite candidates by Wednesday. So you only have 2 days to before you have to invite the candidates. All right, you have not started reviewing applications yet. There are 985 applications waiting for you in a file. All right. How are you going to select the candidates that you interview? So go ahead, pause the video if you need to for a moment, but I want you to take a minute and think about the answer to this question before you move forward. So if you've given some thought to the case that I just presented, you probably thought, well, there's no way I could ever have complete information. And that's where bounded rationality comes into play. Okay. So most people respond to a complex problem by reducing it to a level which we can understand. Okay. And then so we kind of move some of that information out there. So we might not look at all 985 applications. Okay. We might skim through, we might look for things that are going to just meet our needs. Okay, and that's called satisficing. We seek solutions that are satisfactory and sufficient. So if I have 985 applications, I might not look through them for the best 3. I might just look through till I find 3 that meet my needs. Okay, and that's how we kind of operate within these bounds of bounded rationality. Is we build kind of simplified models that take the essential features of information that we need and we use that to make our decisions. As we apply the bounded rationality model to that case, one way that we can think about this is, okay, so we've identified our problem. We need to identify someone we can hire. What's our search criteria? Maybe we want somebody with past sales experience. Maybe we want somebody with a certain level of education. Okay, but we go through and we have our criteria and we start looking through real quickly. We're not reading all the applications in detail, and then we kind of limit that list. We bring that list down from 985 to a more manageable number based upon this criteria. And we eventually look and say, okay, we found some solutions that are good enough. Now, intuitive decision making, this occurs when we operate kind of outside of conscious thought. We're not necessarily thinking through a well-defined process. Okay, and an example of intuitive decision making that I can give you is when I was back in the field of retail management. There was a time on Black Friday that we didn't get a ton of product to put out, and I could tell that, by 9 o'clock we were going to have some really empty areas. So I told my team, I said, we need to get some other things staged and ready so we have some other things to sell. My team was ready to run some analyses, and I said I want to just walk around and let's take a quick look. And I started looking in our overheads, okay, where we stored some of our backup inventory, and I started pointing at things and saying I want that down, I want that down, I want that down. And one of my managers says, "How do you know what you want down?" And I said, "I can look at all that stuff." I said, "It's stuff that we're not selling." I said, "We need to put it on the floor on our highest traffic day of the year." And he said, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe that you're just making a gut feeling on that." And that essentially is intuitive decision making. And then what my manager did were, was my manager went and then pulled sales numbers on all these things that I told him to bring down. And he came back to me. He said, "Hey, boss, like, how did you know that these were the right things?" He said, "The sales numbers, when I pulled it, this is exactly, these look like really good decisions." And my intuition, it was based on kind of associations that I was looking at. I was seeing things that had faded cardboard, things that looked dirty, and I was basically saying this stuff must have been sitting here a while. Now's our chance to get rid of it. But the key was that we didn't just go off my intuitive decision making. My manager who worked for me, went and then also pulled sales numbers and inventory numbers and verified that my gut feelings or my intuitions were supported by data as well. Now, there are a lot of biases that can influence our decision making. Okay, the first one we'll talk about here is overconfidence bias, and this is basically where you kind of think that you're right about something and you double down on it, so to speak. Okay, and the funny thing about overconfidence bias is that individuals who are intellectually kind of the weakest are the ones who are most likely to overestimate their performance and ability. They're the most likely to double down on things, and this can be extremely frustrating when we're interacting with people in the workplace because the least intellectual people will be the ones who often are the least flexible in terms of giving in on a decision because of this overconfidence bias. Another type of bias is anchoring bias, and this is where we get kind of fixated on initial information, and this can be very important in negotiations. So, if, for instance, if I was looking for a job and they said, "What kind of salary are you interested in?" and I gave them a number, and maybe I said, "I'm interested in a range from 60 to $70,000," and the person who I'm speaking with heard that $60,000 and they got anchored there. Now their negotiation is based on something in that 60 range. Okay, that becomes very very problematic. Okay, we deal with similar things when we're negotiating with customers and clients, right? Once we give somebody a range of what we can charge for a price for a product or a ballpark, they start to expect that that's going to be what we can do. So, because of anchoring bias, we often want to be very careful with what information we give people because once we give people information, we've sort of set their expectations and influenced how they're going to make decisions moving forward. Another type of bias that influences us in the workplace is called confirmation bias. And this is where we seek out information that helps to justify our choices. So for example, when I was in management, I brought in a new product line at one point in time. The product line was kind of a dud. It wasn't really the best decision. It was a risk. I knew it was a risk. I took a lot of risks as a manager. But when people would ask me about the product line, I would always speak to like one or two situations where having that product line in stock was really helpful. I often discounted the overall sales of the product line, but considered it within the portfolio of what I was doing in my business. Okay. And in large part, that was due to confirmation bias, in that I was looking for information that supported my decision. We're also impacted by availability bias, and this is when we base our judgments on information that's readily available. So the more something shows up in the news, the more something shows up on reports, that it's going to influence our decision making process. So it may not always be the most important things that we're making decisions based upon, but it's the information that is in front of us the most that influences our decisions. One of the most dangerous biases that we can be influenced by in organizations is what's called escalation of commitment. And this is where we stay with the decision even when we know that the decision is wrong. And often it deals with like a sunk cost fallacy, that we're like, hey, we've invested $500,000 into this project and we just keep going. Okay. So I think an example that I would give from when I was in industry was during the recession. I was at a company that was changing its business system, and we had invested a lot of money into changing the business system. But what was happening was during the recession, we really needed to be putting our resources into trying to capture new business, trying to develop new efficiencies. But instead, we were putting more and more resources into this new business system. And in part because of what we had put into it to begin with. And the reality is we probably needed to pause that project at that moment. because by not pausing the project, what we were doing was we were keeping from investing resources where we needed them to respond to what was going on in the environment. Instead, we kept the project going, we kept investing heavily into it, and ultimately the company did not survive through the recession. So that's an example of escalation of commitment, which is when we keep staying with the decision when there's evidence that it might not be the right thing to do because of what we've already invested into it. Now, randomness error is when we kind of believe that we can predict the outcome of random events, or when we associate outcomes with random events. Okay, so we try to make meaning out of things that aren't necessarily meaningful. So, we might look at something like every time I hire a person from this college, it doesn't work out well, so I'm not considering anybody from this college anymore. Well, the reality is that if we're looking at how many people we've hired from one specific college, we probably don't have enough data to make a real determination as to whether or not people from that college can work for us in our organizations, because we probably only hired like one or two. So in that case, we'd be looking at a situation where we have a randomness error. We hired one or two people from a college, they didn't work out, and we say every time we hired from this college, it doesn't work. Okay, in that case, we're making meaning out of something that's not necessarily meaningful. Now, before we get into our next bias, I want you to take a moment and think about your answer to the following question. Would you prefer a 50-50 chance to win $100, or would you prefer $40 guaranteed? Take a moment, stop the video, think about that, and then move forward. Now, if you responded that you would prefer the $40, you might be a little bit risk averse. Risk aversion is when we have a tendency to prefer a sure thing instead of a risky outcome. Okay, and in the example I just gave you, the economic value of a 50-50 chance to win $100 is actually greater than $40 guaranteed, which is why I said if you preferred the $40, you might have some aversion to risk. All right. And often what we see with risk aversion is that people who are ambitious, people who are powerful, people who have a lot of assets, they often can be risk averse because they don't want to risk losing all the things that they have. And this is why we often see our managers and particularly our executive and senior leadership in organizations be very concerned about engaging in risky behaviors and look at things through a little more of a conservative lens to try to make sure that they don't risk losing what they have. People are often also plagued by something called hindsight bias. And this is where we kind of look backwards and we believe that we could have predicted an outcome, which really, in all reality, we probably couldn't. So we might say, oh, I should have invested in that stock. Like I knew that stock was going to hit big. No, you had no idea that stock was going to hit big. If you knew that stock was going to hit big, you would have invested. But what happens is when we are plagued by this hindsight bias, we get so caught up in worrying about what we could have and should have done that we don't focus our attention on what we need to do moving forward. Now, ethics also influence our decision making, and behavioral ethics is an area that analyzes how people behave when confronted with ethical dilemmas. Okay, when I was in industry, this was often a very salient point because not everybody who was in my company held the same ethical standards, and there were some times that I received directives to do things that I didn't find ethical, and I would have to push back on my boss about some of the directives that I would get. There were times that I saw other managers give directives to their subordinates that their subordinates didn't think were ethical, and we had to be able to engage in these dialogues and figure out how we were going to work through these areas. But ethics played an important role in our decision making process. Now, the reality is that ethics is a very in-depth topic. I teach an entire course on ethics, so we're not going to try to dive into it too deeply here in terms of acting like we can capture it in a slide or two. But I am going to talk about one aspect here on this next slide. One of the most important ethical issues that we can consider in our decision making process is lying. Okay, and lying is critical to decision making because what it does is it basically puts sound decision making at risk, right? Because we can't make good decisions off of false information. So lying is extremely problematic in organizations. One of the biggest problems with lying, though, is that we have to recognize that it's easier to prevent lying than to identify it. All right. So sometimes we have to look at how do we motivate people to not lie? How do we make it okay for people to tell the truth? If somebody did something wrong, is it is it okay for them to come in and tell their manager, or are they going to get in trouble for doing the wrong thing? Well, if they're going to get in trouble if they acknowledge that they did the wrong thing, then we're incentivizing them to lie, and then we're not going to have good information, and we're not going to be able to make good decisions off of the information that we have. So we do have to think about how do we encourage our employees to be truthful in their responses in the work that they do. There are a variety of constraints within our organizations that influence our decision making. All right. And we're going to touch on a few of them here. The first one is performance evaluation systems. All right. So, as we consider performance evaluation systems, we get evaluated every year. We know what we're going to be evaluated on. Those behaviors are the behaviors that we're going to focus on. All right. So, I work for a consulting company that one of the things they evaluated you on was whether or not you picked up the phone and called people, or if you just sent emails, and they preferred that you picked up the phone. So there were times that I could have sent an email. It would have been more efficient for me. It would have been more efficient for the person at work who I had to speak to, but I would pick up the phone and call because I knew when it came time for performance evaluation that I wanted to be evaluated favorably on that. Okay. Reward systems are another area. There was a time I can remember back before I was in management when I was in sales where I had an opportunity to sell a job lot of product, and I had to sell it at a really low price. The price would have still been profitable, but the way our bonuses were structured, it would have actually hurt my bonus. So I declined to sell the package at that price. My boss came up to me and talked to me about that later, and he asked me, he said, we really should have sold this. Why didn't you sell it? And I explained to him. Um, it was pretty simple. I wasn't going to act outside of my own best interest. I wasn't going to do something that put my bonus in harm's way. All right. Interestingly enough, the company ended up reworking the reward system shortly after that so that employees were incentivized to make all profitable sales. All right. We also have formal regulations. So companies have rules that we have to follow. Sometimes there's time constraints. If I have to make a decision in under an hour, that's gonna limit the amount of information that I can incorporate into that decision because it's going to limit my information gathering. All right. And then often we also have historical precedents. So, companies have stories, right, of what we've done in the past, and there's expectations that we're going to do similar things moving forward. As we get ready to wrap up here, we're going to talk about a couple of outcomes and decisions that are influenced by our perceptions here. Okay. And the first one's the employment interview. Unfortunately, we often apply too many shortcuts in interviews. And what happens is somebody enters the interview room and we've evaluated them already. Okay. Either I like their tie. I don't like their tie. I like their shoes. I don't like their shoes. I don't like their stride, the way they walked in. They're not sitting in the right place. They are sitting in the right place. We think about all these things that actually have nothing to do with the interview, and we start to draw judgments before people have even answered a single question. These early impressions, they influence how we evaluate candidates. Um, and for the most part, that influence is unfair to the candidate and can keep us from making our best judgment in the interview. Often we have some issues with self-fulfilling prophecies and performance expectations as well. So there's evidence that people kind of validate perceptions whether or not they're true, and this brings us to a self-fulfilling prophecy or the Pygmalion effect, which basically says that our expectations determine our behavior. All right, so I was actually talking to my son on the phone pretty recently, and he said to me, I always thought I was bad at math, when I was a kid. He said, "I don't actually think I'm bad at math now." He goes, "I just think I thought I was bad at math, so I didn't even try. I just let that become my identity." And we do these types of things in organizations all too often. Some examples might be that if you expect bad writing, you're going to see bad writing. If you expect poor performance, you're going to see poor performance. So sometimes as a manager, when I'd go into a new location, so a different manager would tell me that an employee was a top performer or that another employee was a bottom performer. And that would often influence the way that I saw their performance when I first got there. And it took a while to kind of get past these expectations and be able to form some more objective opinions. And what I just talked about is pretty problematic because employees' performance evaluations are often heavily influenced by perceptions. They tend to be very subjective. Okay, it's not all that often that we're making performance evaluations based strictly on objective data. There's often subjective criteria and subjective measures in there, but these can be problematic because of selective perception, contrast effects, halo effects, and a lot of the other biases that we talked about. So you do want to make sure that you build as much structure into your performance evaluation process as you can to ensure that these biases aren't influencing how you evaluate your employees. And with that, I want to thank you for joining me here for this video today. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something, and we'll talk to you soon.